I found out my father had less than 2 months to live from a cousin's Facebook post, 3 weeks after he'd actually been diagnosed, and the caption underneath a photo of my sister sitting beside his hospital bed read, "So grateful, I'm the one who's actually been here for him." Unlike some people. I was this some people. I had called my father's phone 41 times in those 3 weeks. Every single call had gone straight to voicemail, and I would later learn exactly why. My name is Whitney, and this is the story of how my own sister quietly, deliberately engineered a narrative that I had abandoned our dying father during his final months, a narrative she constructed specifically by making sure I never actually received the calls and messages that would have told me he was dying in the first place. I want to explain what my relationship with my father looked like before this happened, because I think understanding the depth of that relationship matters enormously to understanding just how devastating this entire situation ultimately became. My father, Robert, and I had always been close, arguably closer than he was with my sister Kim throughout most of our adult lives, a dynamic that I understand, in hindsight, may have contributed to some of what eventually unfolded, though I want to be clear that I never once treated my relationship with our father as some kind of competition, the way I eventually learned Kim apparently had. I lived roughly 3 hours away from my father throughout most of my adult life, a distance that had never previously prevented consistent, warm communication between us, weekly phone calls, regular visits every few months, the kind of relationship that felt genuinely close despite the physical distance. Kim lived considerably closer, roughly 20 minutes from our father's house, a proximity that had always meant she handled more of the day-to-day practical support he occasionally needed as he aged, an arrangement I'd always appreciated and never resented, understanding that geography naturally created different roles for each of us in supporting him. I remember, specifically, a conversation with my father roughly a year before his diagnosis, during one of our regular Sunday phone calls, where he mentioned, almost offhandedly, how much he looked forward to these weekly calls, joking that Kim, despite living so much closer, called considerably less often than I did from 3 hours away. I remember feeling a small flicker of concern about how that comment might land if Kim ever heard it repeated, though I never imagined, at the time, that this kind of ordinary, affectionate observation from our father might eventually factor into something as devastating as what actually unfolded. I want to describe the specific circumstances surrounding my father's diagnosis, because the timeline, once I fully understood it, revealed a deliberate pattern of interference that took me considerable effort to fully piece together. My father was diagnosed with advanced pancreatic cancer roughly 2 months before I learned about it through that devastating Facebook post, a diagnosis that came with a genuinely difficult prognosis, doctors estimating he likely had somewhere between 2 and 4 months remaining. According to what I eventually pieced together, Kim had been present at the initial diagnosis appointment and had, from that very first day, apparently begun a deliberate campaign to control and limit the flow of information reaching me, for reasons I'm still working to fully understand even now, well over a year after everything eventually came to light. I want to describe the specific mechanics of how this interference actually worked, because understanding the deliberate, sustained nature of what Kim did matters considerably to understanding the full scope of this betrayal. I learned, eventually, that Kim had, within days of our father's diagnosis, contacted our father's phone service provider, presenting herself as having power of attorney over his affairs, a claim that was, at that specific point, actually false, since our father hadn't yet formally granted her that authority, and requested that his phone be set up with call blocking for a specific list of numbers she provided, including my own cell phone number. I want to try to describe the specific, sickening realization of understanding that every single one of my 41 calls during those 3 critical weeks had been deliberately, systematically blocked before they could ever reach my father, meaning that from his own perspective, sitting in his hospital bed during what he understood to be his final months, he likely believed I simply wasn't calling at all, reinforcing whatever narrative Kim was apparently constructing about my absence during this critical period. I discovered the truth of this situation roughly 3 weeks after that devastating Facebook post, when I finally, in desperation, drove the 3 hours to my father's house unannounced, having grown genuinely frantic after weeks of unanswered calls and vague, dismissive responses from Kim whenever I'd managed to reach her directly, asking why our father wasn't answering my calls. I want to describe that drive, 3 hours of building dread and confusion, having learned, only through that accidental Facebook post, that my father was dying, unable to understand why neither he nor Kim had directly told me something this significant, why my repeated calls had gone entirely unanswered for weeks during what I now understood was an urgent, time-sensitive situation. I arrived at my father's house to find him home, out of the hospital for what turned out to be a brief period between treatment sessions, and I want to describe the specific, devastating moment of seeing his face when I walked through his front door unannounced. Genuine surprise, followed quickly by something that looked, unmistakably, like confusion and hurt. I remember standing in that doorway for a long moment, taking in how much thinner and more fragile he looked than the last time I'd seen him, barely 4 months earlier. The physical toll of both his illness and, I would soon understand, weeks of believing his own daughter had abandoned him during his final crisis. "Whitney," he said, his voice weaker than I remembered from our last conversation months earlier, "I didn't think you were coming. I didn't think you wanted to be here, given everything." I want to try to describe the specific, vertiginous shock of that statement, understanding, in that moment, that my father believed I had known about his diagnosis for weeks and had simply chosen not to visit or call, a belief that made no sense given my actual experience of the preceding weeks, but that, I would soon learn, had been carefully, deliberately cultivated by Kim throughout this entire period. "Dad, I didn't know," I said, my voice breaking as the full weight of the situation began crystallizing. "I found out 3 weeks ago, from a Facebook post. I've called 41 times since then. Every single call went to voicemail. What is happening?" I want to describe watching my father's expression shift, moving through what appeared to be genuine confusion, followed by a slow, dawning horror as he began to understand, in real time alongside me, that something was fundamentally wrong with the narrative he'd apparently been given about my supposed absence and disinterest. "Kim told me you knew," he said, his voice carrying a fragility that broke my heart even amid my own rising anger and confusion. "She told me you knew right away, that first week, and that you said you were too busy with work to come right now, that you'd visit when things settled down more. She's been telling me that every time I've asked why you haven't called." I want to try to describe the specific, layered devastation of this discovery, not just learning that Kim had somehow blocked my calls from ever reaching our father, but understanding that she had simultaneously, actively constructed a false narrative directly to him, explaining my apparent silence in a way specifically designed to make me appear callously indifferent to his dying, rather than simply, genuinely unaware. I confronted Kim directly later that same evening, once our father had gone to bed, exhausted from both his illness and the emotional weight of our earlier conversation. I found the actual call blocking records myself, on our father's phone, still visible in the carrier's account settings, definitively confirming that my number had been specifically, deliberately added to a blocked contacts list roughly 4 days after his initial diagnosis. "How could you do this?" I asked her, standing in our father's kitchen, the same kitchen where we'd shared countless family dinners throughout our childhood. "He's dying, Kim. You made him believe I didn't care enough to call him during the last months of his life. Why would you do something this cruel?" Kim's explanation, delivered through what became an increasingly defensive, tearful confrontation, revealed a depth of long-standing resentment I hadn't fully understood existed beneath the surface of our relationship throughout our entire adult lives. "You've always been his favorite," she said, her voice carrying genuine, raw bitterness. "Even living 3 hours away, even barely being around for the day-to-day stuff, somehow you're still the one he lights up for every single time. I've been the one doing everything, for years, and when he got sick, I thought, finally, this could be mine. This could be the one thing where I actually get to be the daughter who shows up, without you swooping in and reminding him why he loves you more." I want to try to describe the specific complexity of processing this explanation, understanding, on one level, the genuine pain and long-standing insecurity clearly underlying Kim's actions, while simultaneously remaining utterly devastated by the specific, calculated cruelty of what she'd actually done, not simply competing for our father's attention in some more ordinary, if still painful, sibling rivalry, but actively, deliberately isolating him from me during what both of us should have understood, immediately, was an urgent, time-limited opportunity to share his final months together. I want to describe the difficult, painful weeks that followed this confrontation, working to rebuild both my relationship with my father during his remaining time, while simultaneously processing genuine, significant anger toward Kim that I struggled to fully set aside, even while understanding the urgent priority of maximizing whatever time remained with our father. I moved temporarily into my father's guest room for the final 6 weeks of his life, taking leave from work to be fully present, determined not to lose any additional time to whatever complicated family dynamics had already stolen from us. I want to describe those 6 weeks as some of the most meaningful, if devastating, of my entire life. Long conversations with my father about our shared history, quiet afternoons simply sitting together, the kind of presence I'm deeply grateful I was ultimately able to provide. even understanding how much of our limited remaining time together had already been stolen by Kim's deliberate interference. I remember one specific afternoon, about 3 weeks into that final stretch, sitting with my father in his garden, both of us quiet for a long stretch before he turned to me and said, "I'm glad you found out. I don't know how I would have gone through this not understanding why you'd stopped calling. I would have died thinking you didn't care, and that would have been so much worse than the cancer itself." I remember not being able to respond to that for several minutes, simply holding his hand, understanding how close we'd genuinely come to exactly that devastating, false ending. I want to describe my father's own process of understanding what had happened, watching him move through his own complicated grief regarding Kim's actions during his final weeks, torn between anger at what she'd done and a parent's difficult, persistent love for a child, even in the aftermath of genuinely serious wrongdoing. He spoke with Kim directly about it once, during one of the final clear, lucid conversations before his condition deteriorated more significantly, a conversation I wasn't present for, but that he later described to me as painful but necessary, expressing his hurt and disappointment while also, characteristically, extending more grace toward her explanation than I found myself able to extend in those final weeks. My father passed away just under 6 weeks after I first learned the truth, and I want to be honest that even amid profound grief, I carried a genuine, if complicated, gratitude that I'd at least had those final 6 weeks with him, understanding how easily Kim's deception could have continued indefinitely, potentially preventing me from ever properly saying goodbye at all, had I not happened to see that specific Facebook post at exactly the moment I did. I want to describe the aftermath of my father's death, navigating both ordinary grief and the significantly more complicated question of my relationship with Kim going forward, understanding that whatever grace our father had shown her during those final weeks, I still needed to determine, for myself, how to process what she'd actually done and what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted to maintain with her afterward. I haven't fully reconciled with Kim in the time since our father's death, though we maintain limited, functional contact primarily around the practical logistics of settling his estate. I've made clear to her that I understand, intellectually, the underlying insecurity and long-standing pain that apparently motivated her actions, without that understanding translating into anything resembling forgiveness for the specific, deliberate cruelty of isolating me from our dying father during his final weeks. I want to describe one difficult conversation Kim and I had, roughly 4 months after our father's death, during which she attempted, for the first time, something approaching a genuine apology rather than simply an explanation of her underlying motivations. "I know what I did was unforgivable," she told me. "I think I convinced myself, at the time, that I was just trying to finally get the relationship with Dad I'd always wanted, and I didn't let myself think clearly about what I was actually taking away from both of you in the process. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed you to know I understand now how much damage I actually caused, not just to you, but to whatever peace Dad could have had if he'd understood the truth sooner. I've spent considerable time in therapy since this all happened, processing not just the grief of losing my father, but the specific, additional trauma of understanding how close I came to losing my final opportunity to properly say goodbye to him, due to my own sister's deliberate, calculated interference. My therapist has helped me understand that my anger toward Kim doesn't need to resolve into forgiveness on any particular timeline, that some betrayals, particularly those touching something as irreplaceable as the final months of a parent's life, may simply require ongoing, ambivalent processing rather than the clean resolution either genuine reconciliation or permanent estrangement might represent. If you've ever discovered that someone close to you had deliberately manipulated your access to a dying loved one, stealing time you can never recover, I want to hear how you found your way through processing both the grief and the specific, additional betrayal simultaneously. I used to believe that even amid ordinary sibling rivalry or long-standing family tension, certain moments, a parent's final illness, the urgent, limited window of time before death, existed in some protected category, immune to the kind of deliberate interference I ultimately experienced. I've learned, in the most painful way possible, that even those most sacred, time-limited opportunities can become casualties of long-standing, unaddressed family resentment, and that sometimes the only protection against losing them entirely is discovering the truth in time, however accidentally that discovery might arrive.